Then hello and thank you very much for the introduction. Don't have to introduce myself anymore. So actually it's an honor for me. It's actually the first time that I'm here in person speaker. I did already some at the Angular Graz meetup, but never really in person. Good. So I don't think I have to introduce myself. Manfred has already done this. And I want to start a little bit with the signal store and maybe also from the perspective of a consumer, of a potential consumer who wants to use it. Maybe if the signal store is something new to you, then maybe you will have a very similar development. So first of all, I'm one can say a fan of the NGRX global store. I've been using it since 2015, 2016 already. And to be honest, I'm quite happy with it. So I really didn't have any plans to change it or so. And when more or less Angular released version 16 with signals, I was also quite happy that the NGRX global store and the component store reacted very fast and also provided more or less like the select signal method where we can have a signals integration directly into the from the NGRX store itself. Then some few days later, I saw the PR from Marco about the signal store. It looked a little bit strange with all those methods. And to me, the question was why? So why do we actually have the need for a third store in that sense? Because if I have to maintain a huge application, changing something is always extremely hard, and there has to be a real reason for it. And in a way, I struggled quite a lot. We also approached Marco at the NGConf, I think all the three of us, and we asked him what the reason is for a third store, is if it is not possible in kind of merging those new features into the NGRX global store or the component store, because we really don't want to change something. And he explained it. He explained a little bit more into detail what the problems are with the classes and so on and so forth. And for me, it took some time until I realized what is actually the real benefit or what the key advantage of the signal store is. And to me, it's the extensibility. Because if you look at the global store, at the component store, they are not that easily extensible, but with the signal store, it's actually quite easy. So regarding which one we should choose, it was very fast, more or less clear that the future will definitely be in the signal store. Marco also kind of then confirmed this unofficially in one of the podcasts where he was asked, what should you do if you start a new project? And the answer was more or less, well, the recommendation is to go with the signal store. So if you can read between the lines, you know already what you have to do then. And then of course we kind of took a closer look to the signal store, played with it. And very soon we realized that there are some things where we would say, maybe one can add a feature or maybe one can improve it a little bit. And my personal highlights, more or less, are, first of all, the encapsulation. So we know that with the signal store, when we have the patch state function, we can always kind of access the state itself from the outside of the signal store, so I can more or less kind of manipulate the state in a component, in a service, wherever I want. With the global store, that's not easy. We have our reducers, and only there the change happens. The other thing was that maybe with those kind of extensions that we have available, that we maybe fix a very long-running project, which was never really fine, and this was more or less the NGRX data project, which kind of promises quite a lot, but in a way it was always very hard to use. The promise that the NGRX data project kind of makes is that we have a generic service for managing entities, and we only need to extend from that service. We don't need to write any other code in the best case, and the persistence and the communication with the backend is done automatically. The problem with NGRX data are always the extension points. If you are not following exactly the pattern as the NGRX data sees it, it's extremely hard. But with the signal store, with this kind of extensibility, this would be a good option. And then, of course, the top two, Redux. So as I said, I'm a big fan of the NGRX global store. So for me, the Redux pattern is really useful. This kind of structure that it really enforces, kind of having a list of actions, having a reducer, where I know only the reducers are those places where the state changes. And if I have some kind of side effects, if I want to connect to a backend, then I know that this is more or less located in the effects. So I have a very good structure. And even if I don't know the application, if it's using the NGRX Global Store, this is something where I can take a look and I immediately understand what's going on there. And the last thing was then more or less are the dev tools. So because we were more or less quite happy, or we really understood that this is now, the signal store is the thing to go to, we started in a way kind of wanting to contribute to something. So I made a PR about, for example, Redux. So I created a prototype where I said, okay, this would be the way how I would imagine that maybe we can also integrate the Redux pattern into the signal store. And then the official answer was that, yeah, it's good, but it is more or less a question of a community contribution. So it's not something which will end up in the core package in that sense. And in terms of dev tools, was similar. For dev tools, we can expect very soon that the Angular team itself will bring some tools or some visualizations in their dev tools which allow us to get an insight into the signals. So in that way, of course, maybe one doesn't have to come up with an own DevTools project. So the answer was yes, we can do it, but it will not end up in the core. It needs to come from the community. And the problem with a community is always somebody else, not me. And so I decided, okay, good, somebody else will do it. And actually last week in our Slack channel, Michael said, yo, by the way, I'm working on a Redux integration into the signal store. Then Manfred said he has written this kind of data service, which is very similar to NGRX data. He also wants to do this, and I also had some plans. So I thought, okay, what if we kind of merge all our work together, kind of bringing in all those contributions, because then it's not just a one-man show. When we're talking about a community project, then we are already 3, and we have a little bit of a more push. And this is exactly what this is all about, this talk. So today, actually in a few minutes, I'm going to publish now a new NPM library, which is the Angular Architect's NGRX Toolkit. The name actually comes from the Redux Toolkit. So for those of you who are working with React, Toolkit has quite a name. And yeah, so what can you expect? At the moment, it has 3 authors. That's the 3 of us. I hope that new will come soon. I also hope that Marco could maybe help us in some of these cases. It's exclusive for the Signal Store. So we really think that the Signal Store will be the future. We don't want to invest too much effort anymore into the global store and also not in the component store. It's, of course, beta status. It's not very old. And the extensions that you have more or less right now are the DevTools and the Redux support. So you have, when you install them, you have immediately access to a DevTools extension, and in a very minimalistic way, you can also use the Redux pattern in the Signal Store. What you can expect in the future is encapsulation extension, so that you can really define which kind of properties you want to expose, which also allows you to say, I don't want to expose anything, I will just kind of expose certain methods, but nobody can more or less patch the state from the outside anymore. Data service, this would be Manfred's contribution. And then we also have something which stands out more or less, and this is what Michael will then talk about later. The DevTools, the Redux, the encapsulation, the data service, they are all simple extensions, so with methods that you can just apply to this signal state. And the opinionated abstraction layer is really a layer on top of it. Don't want to say too much, because Michael will do it afterwards. All right, so this is more or less, these are the green color are more or less the features which we have right now, and what I also want to show you. Good. So the plan is that I'm able to publish. It did not work before. Let's see if it works now. Yeah. So let's see. NPM publish, access public. Oh, okay. Yeah, yes, yeah. Danke. Yeah, now we have to use it. So immediately, exactly. So we have here some application which is already using the signal store. It's the common flight search, which might be familiar to some of you, just a little different layout. If I click here on search, I'm getting some flights shown. And what we also have in addition is here this comments, which works with a defer block. So there are some lazy loading. In that sense, we are kind of lazy loading here already a signal store. So what do I have to do? I have to, first of all, go to my application, and I have to say install Angular Architects NGRX Toolkit. I couldn't have done it before, obviously. And
someone has published this, right?
yeah, someone has published it, right? And yeah, the first thing that I want to do is that I want to kind of integrate the DevTools. So I go to my flight store, which is now responsible for the flight search. Just to give a quick overview, we have here our state. It's just the flights array that we have. We have our methods. There is just one method, or actually two. Here is this load method, which asynchronously loads the flights from the backend, then patches the state. And for obvious reasons, if we go to our Redux DevTools, we don't see here anything. No store found. So what you have to do now is that you just say with DevTools, and there are two of them. This would be my fallback project. I'm using the latest one. And then I only have to provide a name. So when you know the global store, you know that you have feature states, and this is more or less the same how it works here. You really have to provide a name for it. So I say here that's more or less flights. And that's everything you have to do. Because if I now go back, we see here that the signal store shows already something, and these are the flights. And if I now search for something, we are getting here also an update. So we see here store update. If I click on diff, then we see here also that more or less the Redux dev tool work in the same way as we used to it. Maybe something about the details. By default, if you don't do anything else except kind of only saying with DevTools, every state change will have the name store update, but you also have the option to name your actions as well. If you want to name them, then everything you have to do is that you have to import patch state from the NGRX toolkit. I'm not sure if this is the best idea. Maybe we will change it. Maybe use a different name because it might be a little bit confusing. But at the moment, this is how it is. So patch state is then more or less a wrapper function around the original patch state. And then you can say here, flights loaded. And you can then also say here, this would be the delay action. And if you then would go back, and if I would here again click on search, then we see immediately that flights load is then also used. Of course, with all those changes. So this works very, very nice. There are still some challenges, especially if you are providing the signal store in a component and not on a global level. And especially if the same store is provided multiple times, this can also happen. The plan here is that we would then more or less index the feature name itself. So you wouldn't have here a flights, but you would have a flight 1, a flight 2, a flight 3. And also with the hooks, we know if a signal store is already destroyed, then we would also more or less remove it. So this is more or less the plan, what we are currently working on here. But if you're using the signal store globally, there is nothing else for you to do. Just install it and use it right away. Yeah, and of course, it also works with lazy loading. So if I now go to my comments component, remember this is this kind of lazy loaded components with a defer block. It also uses here a comment store. And if I say here, okay, with DevTools, and it should be comments, and I would then more or less activate the lazy loading, then we will see that this, of course, ends up here as well. So we have here at the moment just the flights. But if I click here on comments, then the comments component together with the signal store would be lazily loaded. So if I do this now, we see that the store updates immediately, and we have in the state both flights and comments available. Internally, this is done via an effect. So we know that when something has changed in the different states, that then the synchronization with the Redux DevTools happens. So that's more or less was the easier part. The harder part was the second feature, which is the Redux feature. So for those of you who don't know Redux, it's kind of a very strict structure where I already explained it. We have three main elements. We have actions, which in a way can be seen as the events. We have reducer, which contains the kind of logic which updates our state, and only the reducer and nothing else is allowed to do that. And then we have the effects, where we can use dependency injection and can do asynchronous stuff and so on. So this very strict structure. And I will use this now also for my flight store. So what do I have to do? I can use with DevTools, I can also remove it. They are not depending on each other, so you can really use whatever you want. But I just leave it. So I say here with Redux. And what it wants is first of all the actions. And I say here it's more or less an object literal. So for those of you who already use NGRX Global Store, this looks very familiar. It was also kind of, the idea was also to do it more or less in the same way. So I say here load. The function is called here payload. That's maybe different, it's not the props. And then I can say for the loading, I need to use the from and the to. These are my two action parameters. And then I also have loaded, where again, I would say, okay, here comes then more or less the flights array. So, and the flight is not available for whatever reason. Yeah, of course, I also need to close it. What actions also provides you, this is something new, because those actions, they will end up in methods out to the outside. You can also hide them. So there is also an option to say here public, and then I could more or less only provide the load, and I could say, okay, the loaded, that's a private one. Which means you can use the loaded action inside of your reducers, inside of your signal store, but not to the outside anymore. Good. If somebody of you see me doing something strange in terms of coding, please let me know. Then we have our reducer. The reducer, first of all, has two arguments. We have the actions, and we also have the on function, which we also know. And here we can then more or less react to existing actions. So I can say here, when, for example, the loaded action happens, what I want to do then is that I have a reducer function where the first parameter is the action's payload, and the second one is then more or less the state. There is a typo. There is a little bit of a type bug. Let's call it like this, but it will still work. So I've kind of fetch here out the flights from the payload, and then I say, okay, the state is also there, and I then just say patch state, provide the state as it is. We have here our patch state, I guess, so I also need to provide here the action name. Say here, okay, flights loaded. And then I more or less provide the flights as they are. This is this part. And then we also have our effects, where we can more or less do the loading. So the effects also work very similar. They are getting the actions. They have a create function. And here, I just have to say, I only want to react on the load action, because there I want to more or less do the request to the backend. So I say here, I'm going to return an object literal, which contains observables, because somebody has to subscribe to them internally. And I call the first one load. And then I say, okay, I have my create function. The create function should more or less be activated when the load event happens. This returns me now an observable, which I can now usually process with the existing pipe operators, as we have done it already in the effects for many years. So I say here pipe. I'm getting my flight search parameters, so I'm getting here my from and my to. And then I just go and use here my switch map. Sorry, I'd have to use that one first. But then I say here HTTP client, going to copy it, paste it here. Of course, it also supports dependency injection. So I can say here HTTP client, give me the HTTP client. This is what I want to have. And then, if everything works as expected, there is a parenthesis thing, yep. Then the loading should, as we know, return us with the, with the flights. So I can say here, tab, we're getting the flights, and then I just more or less call the action again. So I say here actions, load it, and more or less provide the flights as they are. Now if I'm finished to remove all that stuff, I'm more or less done, because the with state has to go to the top. But the with methods, they can go away. I don't need them anymore. This is now normally the Redux pattern as we know it from NGRX itself. So we have here the actions, reducer, the effects. I guess the application is going to break now, because if we go to our app component, which contains the flight search, we see that the flight store does have the load method. Let me quickly open it. So we see here the only public actions which we defined. The private one is hidden, so we can't dispatch loaded anymore. But of course, we need to provide here an object literal. That's the important thing. So we say here this is a from, and this one is here a to. Yeah, close it like this. Application compiled successfully. And if I now go back, I have my DevTools available. Oh, yeah. And if I click here on search, we see that the data is shown. So in that sense, more or less everybody who really has maybe an interest to use the Redux pattern, this is now possible with the signal store as well. And especially for those who want to migrate maybe, and maybe you can now have a very easy way to take the existing codes from your effects reducers, move it to the signal store, and then incrementally start with the migration if you want to. But if you say, no, I'm quite happy with the Redux pattern as it is, then of course you don't have to change anything. Yeah, and that's more or less everything I have to say. Thank you.